Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the New Energy Advancement Hub, which is a platform offering cutting-edge research, innovative trainings, and business games to drive your successful energy transition. My name is Tatiana Mitrova. I'm director of the New Energy Advancement Hub and research fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy of Columbia University. And today, our guest is Kruthika Anastasia Bala, Managing Director at Resources Now. Kruthika has amazing experience, more than 20 years in consulting and advisory in energy sector. And what I really admire about her approach is very systemic vision and this amazing helicopter view. And unfortunately, today we will need a lot of this system thinking and helicopter view because the topic of our live stream is really very complicated. It's a very complex issue. It's Europe's interlocking crisis, critical minerals and natural gas, and Eurasian geopolitical nexus. A lot to digest in just 1 hour, a lot to discuss. Kruthika, thank you so much for joining us today. So,
Thank you for having me, Tatiana. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
yeah, we actually chat from time to time between two of us, and we decided just to make a broadcast of these very informal discussions without any censorship, sometimes quite cynical, sometimes, okay, maybe better to frame it in the other way, quite balanced and weighted. Let's see how it will be today, but I would really encourage all of you to join us. I mean, don't hesitate to leave your comments, to ask your questions in the chat in LinkedIn, where you see these broadcasts. We will address all your messages. Yeah, and we want to make it a really vivid conversation. We don't know the answers. Yeah, so just to make it clear, I suspect nobody knows the right answers in this case. But what we will try to do today is to draw a broader picture and really to try to frame this crisis. Let me try to start, and Kruthika, you will take it over then. So in 2022, Europe faced really tremendous crisis with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all the sanctions imposed on Russian oil and gas supplies, and Gazprom requiring ruble payments for gas and cutting off those who refused to pay in rubles, and afterwards sabotage on Nord Stream, which actually brought down Russian gas volumes by 80%. It was all happening in just half a year, and it resulted in very high gas prices, much higher than normal oil prices, and a lot of panic and fears in the European industry, among European consumers. Nevertheless, in 2023, the situation seemed to more or less normalize, thanks also to the warm winter. Anyway, but right now, 3 years later, it's not only Russian gas flows missing, but suddenly it turned out that for many decades, good ally of Europe, United States, doesn't actually want to be so aligned and so supportive towards EU, neither in terms of economic security and trade, nor in terms of energy security. So this growing European reliance on the US LNG doesn't seem any longer to be such a blessing and such a secure thing to do. Okay, what are the other options? Europe can take a look at coal, Yeah, but given all the decarbonization agenda, it doesn't seem to be an acceptable solution. Nuclear, well, probably, but not in the short to medium term, because nuclear power plant construction requires 7 to 10 years, even if we start today. So what can Europe do right now? What are the other options? Keeping in mind that energy transition is still very high on the agenda of the European governments, though there are different approaches already, and certain countries start to express their concerns, and certain parties are quite skeptical about green transition. But with green transition, we also have an issue of critical minerals, yeah, which is another part of our discussion today. So it looks like, well, not a dead end yet, but quite a difficult situation for Europe. So, Kruthika, how do you see this situation, and what are your first thoughts?
Very well framed, Tatiana. I was laughing at some of those things. And those are the reality of our situation. So let me start by saying that Europe is no stranger to crisis management, but 2025 is shaping out to be particularly unique, volatile challenge right across the board. Um, this is specifically the one that demands a multi-layered levels of disruptions that we're seeing that cuts across energy security, critical mineral supply chain, and shifting geopolitical alliances. It's almost like a 4D, we're playing a 4D chess, but we're losing out on checkers or something like that. Um, so it shouldn't come, a lot of things that has happened over the last couple of months at least shouldn't come as a surprise, because I think most of us have been expecting a lot in these lines. What this has left is, Europe is scrambling to reassess the strategic positioning in an international order that is fragmenting faster than we all anticipated. And all of this is happening where Europe is still pushing for the energy independence, and it still remains incomplete to a large extent. So, what I also feel like, just to make things worse and matters worse, the transition ambition also depends on the critical minerals, as you touched upon, right? I also feel like we're doing far too many things. We're going after too many what do you call options or priorities, and it's like a boxer that is trying to compete in every weight class all at once. Meanwhile, China and US are focusing on giving knockout punches. So we need to start boxing in every weight class. We really need to start picking and choosing our battles. Right now, we're trying to lead the world in green energy. We're competing with US and China in AI, semiconductors, as well as advanced technology. We're trying to regulate big technology, big techs, while growing our own digital economy. We also want to maintain our social welfare model while industries are really seeking cheaper markets. We talk about human rights, but we also rely on some of these nations where for the energy materials, you know what I mean? So there's a whole lot there. So I think what we really need to focus on, yes, the challenges are plenty, but so are the opportunities. As the saying goes, never get a good crisis go to waste. And this is a really good crisis, but we shouldn't, the key is not to let it go to waste. The era of stable alliances and predictable economic structures, to my mind, seems to be over. And Europe's future, both economically and geopolitically, really depends on how well it's adapting, or it's going to adapt to all of these multi-layered disruptions that we talked about. So the bottom line is we need to shift from reactive crisis management to really being proactive and do a strategic reinvention and remain relevant in this increasingly changing landscape is where I feel. But the bottom line is we're doing too many things. Perhaps we need to pick our battles and pick and choose what we need to win. Yeah.
Okay, I like this point. Focus, yeah, it's also the most important thing in the personal time management. We all know this. So where should Europe focus in this situation? If let's first think about energy transition. Yeah. So Europe definitely needs to secure supply chains for critical minerals. It needs, or does it need, to secure its technological sovereignty? That's another question. What is your vision in this respect?
So, just to add a bit of historical context and talk about the current dependencies here for a second. Up to 90% of critical minerals that we need for green technologies, digital innovation, aerospace and defense come from outside the EU. For rare earth elements, it's almost 100%. And over the last 40 years, Europe's share of global mineral production has dropped from 25% to less than 7%. And all this in the meanwhile, while China has expanded its dominance, and we all know for the fact that they process nearly 90% of the world's rare earths and 60% of lithium. So this is more than an economic future. This is more of a strategic issue, in my opinion. And we are witnessing some of the immediate industrial and economic impacts as well. There was a research I read recently from European Investment Bank that states that a staggering 37% of EU firms report that access to commodities and raw materials represent some of the biggest operational obstacles. And then obviously the point that you mentioned earlier on high energy costs and raw materials shortages are already leading to closure, and I think there was news about 15 processing plants closing across Europe. When you think about a new battery material refinery here in Europe costs 3 times more to build than elsewhere, and the operating costs are about 50% or higher. And when we think about electrification, you know, the age of electricity, which IEA very eloquently put together, I loved it. The exploration investment for copper dropped by 6% to around 12.5 billion or 13 billion US dollars in 2024. That also somehow reflects that investor hesitation there. So energy intensive industries in Europe are facing compounding challenges, both in terms of costs and supply chains. When you look at the future demand projections vis-a-vis some of these challenges that we have, EU demand for rare earth elements is projected to increase sixfold by 2030. I'm sure we all read our daily dose of IEA reports or weekly dose of it. Just to reiterate, you know, by 2030, Europe will need sixfold rare earth materials. Lithium is 12-fold. The demand for clean energy is going to triple under the net zero scenario. But today, our supply chains doesn't seem to be ready or quite ready yet. And Europe's self-sufficiency is further complicated by competing global demands in some of the aggressive resource acquisition strategies by China and US and everybody else. So pretty much a perfect storm there. What EU has done really well is, you know, they are responding to these challenges. You know, we saw the introduction of the Critical Materials Act, which is a great step forward, strengthening partnership right across our supply chains. The Raw Materials Alliance, the European Raw Material Alliance, has proposed, I think, about 1.7 billion euros, I think, to be correct, in subsidies for regional mining and processing projects, 30 different energy climate partnerships, and so on. So all of these point towards a good direction. But let's be frank here. No new mines have really opened in the EU in the last 15 years. This is because of a range of factors. This is not just one particular issue. There's long permitting process. Is about 10 to 15 years longer. Environmental regulations, public perceptions, economic viability, and we're also focusing on extending some of the existing mines. So that is also contributing to the absence of new mines. Even with streamlined permits, these projects take time. And public resistance, as we probably see in Serbia, mining alone is not the full answer to the question. There is a notable exception, though, I must say. Imerys, which is a lithium project in France, is expected to begin production in 2028. And this is an indicator of signs that things are slowly starting to change. But achieving CRMA, the Critical Minerals Raw Materials Act, will require substantial coordination between the EU policy, member state implementation, as well as the private sector investment. And investment is a really important bit there. There's not a lot of financing to go around, so we've got to be really picking and choosing our battles. And hence, I said earlier, we've got to pick our battles there. So while EU has seemed to have recognized the strategic importance of these materials, and this is done through the policy frameworks like the CRMA, the path to meaningful supply security is still a bit challenging. And it almost pushes us to think bigger and bolder. And I saw recently a call from some of the industry leaders for a European sovereignty fund to support the raw material production and the raw material and a raw material bank to stabilize the supply. There's also some interesting facts I must point out that there's new lithium projects that are likely to come up in Germany's Rhine region, the Iberian Peninsula. There's a major rare earth discovery in Sweden. They all offer really good hope for reducing dependency. So the question to me really is whether or not Europe understands the problem, which it clearly does. The question is, can we act quickly and decisively enough to solve it? And I said decisively very strongly is we need to be decisive. We need to know where to put our money and time, resource, and effort in. Because let's be honest, even in the best policy environment and political environment, things are as it is difficult. Right now, we're in a particularly unique moment. We really have to be picking and choosing our battles here.
100%. I just thought about Greenland, which is still EU. So, and there are other like neighboring countries, but we will go to them to discuss them a bit later. Right now, I want to jump to the natural gas discussion. Yeah, so with critical minerals, okay, there is some potential in the EU itself, and later on we will discuss some potential outside EU. But what about natural gas? What are the lessons learned from this previous crisis, from all these energy disruptions? What do you think? Are there lessons learned, first of all?
I think so. We have had tactical success, but the strategic blind spots still persist. What has worked across is three areas. We've managed to diversify gas supplies, infrastructure expansion and market coordination has been managed, and as well as demand management to some extent. So, as you mentioned in your earlier comment, the US became Europe's top supplier, LNG supplier, providing 51 BCM in 2024. And although that was down from 62 BCMs in 2023, that's also because of the lower gas demand. And we're sort of blessed with some good weather, although the weather outside here in London is not something to be concerned about. Norway and Azerbaijan ramped up their pipeline deliveries. They added resilience to the systems to some extent. Germany, which now has multiple floating storage regasification units, which are in operation, so that's a great infrastructure win there. The aggregate EU platform has created a framework for collective gas purchasing, which has the potential to strengthen our bargaining power, but it's still relatively new, and therefore I find it really hard to judge the long-term effects of it. So I would say Europe did achieve significant reduction in natural gas demand during the winter of 2022 and 23. The mild winter really helped, and I have to agree with you on that. The industrial outputs were lowered in some instances. So in essence, Europe survived the immediate shock of a war in our backyard, but did not quite, to my mind, solve the deeper structural weaknesses. And there are still some lessons to be learned there. when you think about the structural weaknesses, LNG is a global commodity. We have to compete with Asia, for example, that drives up prices. Short-term contracts and spot market purchases create volatility and unpredictability. And again, I'd love to hear what you think about it. Even though we did reduce our dependence on Russian pipeline gas, we've sort of increased our dependence on LNG, US LNG, and some of the other suppliers. Um, there's nothing wrong with gas remaining a core part of our energy mix. We need that at the moment. The other bit is really where we feel like we could do a little bit more work is on thinking about um, stronger energy ties with certain countries, for example. Um, national interest is often taking precedence over EU-wide strategies. So that's something that is causing policy misalignment in many cases. I wonder what you think about it.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think there was a very nice comment written to my post advertising this event, a comment by Morten Frisch, who says that, first of all, it makes sense to optimize recovery of oil and gas resources inside EU. Absolutely, like you are saying about critical minerals. Yeah, the same. First, look at home. Yeah. But then he is pointing out that long-term contracts, yeah, should be there. And I will 100% agree with that. It was maybe a decade ago that we've written together with Anne-Sophie Corbeau, my colleague from Colombia, about European Union making itself, through liberalization of gas market, extremely vulnerable to the to any change in the global gas market. Yeah, EU like literally imports volatility of the spot gas market because it's so much import dependent. Yeah, and it is the marginal buyer on this market. So this position is not the place where you want to be if you are preoccupied by affordability and reliability of supplies. Okay, reliability, at the end of the day, you will have to pay double, triple the price and like move these LNG cargoes from India or Pakistan to EU, yeah, at triple price or tenfold price. So you will secure these supplies, but it will be extremely expensive. This is the cost of spot market in this situation when you are import dependent. Yeah. So I believe that going into longer term arrangements is absolutely critical for the European Union energy security. But then we are coming to a more interesting part of the discussion. Who could be those suppliers? With whom should EU make these long-term arrangements? So after these recent negotiations between Trump and Putin started, there is a lot of buzz regarding Russian gas restarting flows to EU, either like restarting Ukrainian transit or even restarting Nord Stream. Well, I've shared my quite skeptical opinion in my posts in LinkedIn. Yeah, I don't see economic rationale for the US to go for the revival of Nord Stream. Yeah, I see a lot of risks and constraints for the Ukrainian transit, though I can imagine situation of like going back to the 2024 level, but it doesn't solve the whole European problem with gas supplies. Yeah, so there is US LNG, but we saw that unfortunately it started to be used as a part of this geopolitical game. Yeah. And this, you can imagine a scenario when request or limit on US LNG supplies or additional tariffs or whatever can create risks for the European Union. So I suspect that now European buyers will be much more cautious. They wouldn't rely completely on the US LNG. And then there is Qatar, which would love to see long-term contracts, but which is quite preoccupied by the European requirements on the carbon footprint of this gas and all the disclosures and the regulation that the EU is trying to impose on the LNG exporters. So there is also Azerbaijan, which is supposed to double its pipeline gas supplies to Europe by 2027. At least that was promised. I strongly doubt that it will be delivered in 2027. Caspian is a very difficult province, and all the investments in the upstream, yeah, they are not that easy, these fields to develop, but then all the transit route and transit via Caucasus and then via Turkey. So the pipeline expansion, additional compressor stations and everything, it could be done. Yeah, it's not mission impossible completely, but it requires money. As you've mentioned, at the end of the day, it's all about money. Azerbaijan is quite clear, and I completely agree with their demand. Guys, we need long-term contracts. We are not ready to spend this enormous amount of investments without being sure that they will pay back in the next 20, 25 years. This is the nature of long-term contracts. They provide suppliers some security of demand. Yeah. As the EU is stressing again and again the target of green transition and getting rid of fossil fuels, as a supplier, you are getting nervous. Are these guys serious? Will they need this gas in 10-year time, or will they just say thank you and goodbye? Your gas is no longer in demand. It's okay with LNG. You can redirect it to any other market, but with the pipeline, you are locked with your customer. The same applies to any pipeline from East Med, though I think most of these projects are already frozen. With the LNG in East Mediterranean, like here in Cyprus, where I'm based, again, there are many geopolitical constraints and the region is quite fragile. So we have Turkey, we have Syria, we have Israel, we have Lebanon. So it's quite a difficult area. Nevertheless, there are some solutions on the table, but they are advancing so slowly. And again, keep in mind, developing a good LNG project from scratch, 7 years. Yeah. So they are not there in time. So for Europe to secure LNG supplies, it really requires quite focused, as you said, activity. And I think this example of JERA, this Japanese buyers consortium, could be, and I think it is partially an inspiration for the European policymakers. But I'm afraid it's not sufficient at the moment, this critical moment where actually Europe finds itself. The situation is aggravated by the fact that this long-awaited LNG glut, which was promised by 2025, it actually doesn't happen. The specificity of LNG projects is that most of them get delayed. Yeah, they take longer than expected to construct, and they cost more than expected usually. Yeah, so this new wave of LNG projects, now we are expecting it by 2027, maybe 2028. But again, there could be delays. And if the signals sent by the market are not inspiring for the investors, they can further postpone their projects, like Qatar was actually threatening. If you don't like our LNG, okay, we will not supply it to you. This is the message you don't really want to hear if you are import dependent. So the situation, just summing up, it's not hopeless. There is gas available in the market. There are producers willing to produce, to invest, and to cooperate with the EU, but they need a bit of different treatment. They need longer-term offtake guarantees. They need different types of contracts. If Europe will, like as a matter of principle, say no, only spot, yeah, we decided to get rid of long-term contracts and we will stay without long-term contracts because it's our decision. Okay, it's still possible, but very, very expensive. That's the point.
It's very, very interesting. I had a question on Qatar's gas. So Qatar has long-term LNG contracts with Asia. Do you see that that limits how much it can export to Europe?
Qatar has, so the short answer, no, at the moment. Because Qatar has announced massive expansion of its capacities. Phase one is already in progress. They are building these facilities. There is also phase three and phase four to start in the next few years, and they are like with some question mark. With Qatar, you don't have all the details and all the transparency except what Qatar decides to announce, which is understandable. Qatar has sufficient resources and it can attract capital for the investments, but it is negotiating in quite tough ways, saying that, okay, we have something to propose, but on our conditions. Now Europe
Yeah.
has to take it into account, not just ignoring these requests. But basically, now I want to turn back to you with these. We started already to talk about strategic partnerships for resource diversification. So Qatar, for example, looks as a potential partner. Europe definitely has already these partnerships with North African gas suppliers for quite a long time. They struggle to sustain their production volumes and they will struggle even more to increase their production volumes. But again, it's the matter of management and investment availability and offtake guarantees. So with the critical minerals, do you see any similar partnerships possible in the future?
Possibilities are definitely. I just wanted to make one comment on your last statement before I move on to that critical minerals. It seems to me that China is the silent winner in this. They've secured long-term LNG contracts from Qatar, from Russia, from the US, and they've sort of secured their energy stability at competitive prices. Um,
You know, it,
Europe's energy.
here, if you allow, I will jump in
Please
because
go ahead.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'm following China for like the last 25 years, my goodness. And initially, so from the very beginning of my professional career, I saw that China is so much preoccupied with energy security. So it was not about affordability in the first place, but energy security. And they were following this Churchill's call for diversification, diversification, and diversification again. If you look at the structure of their oil imports, gas imports, or whatever, any other energy commodity, you will see that they are manually adjusting the shares of different suppliers in order not to get too much dependent on any of them. And they spend a lot of time to build long-term relationships with the suppliers, and they spend a lot of money to create stocks, yeah, like with oil stocks or with natural gas. If you look at the number of LNG regas terminals that they've built during the last couple of years, and this spare capacity that of the gas contracts that they actually do not need, but they can trade now all over the world. And once again, reminder, in the winter 2022, Europe actually has received a lot of LNG from China, which China didn't need because they also had these COVID restrictions and winter wasn't that cold. So China supported Europe in a certain way, redirecting the LNG that it didn't need. Yeah, but in the other cases, that would be also a very good trading operation. So China is building up this energy security muscle in a very efficient way and, in a very strategic way. So they started it a quarter of century ago, maybe even before. That's the time period that I'm observing. And it is very, very consistent strategy. It's better to overcontract than to undercontract. It's better to have additional resources than to miss them. It's better to have more potential suppliers. Even if you don't need this gas at the moment, just keep discussing, like with Power of Siberia 2 with Russia. China doesn't need this gas at all right now. But it's better to have the project ready so when the time comes, it can be provided quite quickly. Yeah. So yeah, China for me also seems like a good role model for Europe, at least to look at. Yeah, with all the caveats.
Very interesting. Thank you for always sharing your nuanced views. I think we have a question on this particular issue from Lawrence Jones. What about resources in Guyana and Africa? That's a very interesting angle. I understand European firms like Total are already involved in Guyana's energy sector, and there are scenarios where the projected explosive growth in the oil and gas production. And can you talk a little bit about why Guyana matters to Europe, especially given there is a scenario where the offshore reserves exceed about 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent, and making one of the most significant discoveries in the recent years. And the other really interesting bit is when the production comes online by 2027. I don't want to say if to be too skeptical, but when, let's be hopeful, is expected to reach 1.2 million barrels per day at 2027. So that sort of surpasses some of the OPEC members like Ecuador and Algeria. What are your thoughts on the potential from Guyana and then also in Africa?
Yeah, Guyana, Africa. I mean, you can prolong the list. Well, Guyana is a bit different story because it's mainly oil. Yeah, and we have other questions regarding oil and oil product imports, which is fair question again. Absolutely. These are all options. They all require investments, and in many cases, in Africa specifically, they are associated with a high risk tolerance, just country risk.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
looking
absolutely.
at Mozambique LNG, for example. Yeah, so you have to be prepared to quite different environment. We have also a question from Jean-Philippe
It's,
Fessenet
it,
regarding Iranian gas.
oh,
And
yes.
again, yeah, so
Go for
we
it. No, I was just gonna add on the Guyana bit is we haven't seen any LNG terminals yet. Forgive me if my information is okay, but as far as I understand, there are no LNG export terminals yet in Guyana. So the infrastructure is still in the planning stages, and it's going to take some years to materialize. None of these crops up overnight. There's also the Venezuelan border dispute when it comes to Guyana. Venezuela still claims parts of Guyana or one of the regions in Guyana. I couldn't quite say the name. It starts with an E, but I can't remember it right now. So that also raises this risk of regional stability. But at the moment, it seems like it's flowing to Asia rather than Europe from Guyana's point of view, but you never know where things might change. But please go ahead on Iranian gas. I have nothing to
yeah,
say on Iranian
yeah,
gas.
on
All yours.
On Iranian gas, it's there. I mean, everyone knows that Iran has the world's largest gas deposits. Yeah, just to start with. And it could have been absolute solution for Europe, yeah, if not for the geopolitical risks. Right now, frankly, we do not know if there will be, I mean, hopefully, God bless us, we will avoid it, but there could be a large scale war in the Middle East, and the threats to Iran from the US are only rising. And at the moment, no resolution is visible. So Iran doesn't have enough financial power to invest in the LNG terminals. They do not have access to the technologies because of the sanctions. And I suspect that the US are not willing to provide these technologies, to lift these sanctions in the foreseeable future. So I think we cannot think seriously about Iranian LNG, and then we are left with Iranian pipeline gas, which should go through Turkey. And here it's again absolutely the same story as with Azerbaijan. Okay, the pipelines can be built, it's not a rocket science. Yeah, and this gas can be supplied potentially to Europe, but somebody in Europe has to make tough decision and to put money on the table because Iran doesn't have this money. So who is ready among European investment bankers to make such a bet at the moment? Yeah, taking all the geopolitical risks, yeah, and sanction risks. So that's the problem for me. Yeah, but sorry, I've interrupted you again.
No, go ahead. No, I have nothing to add on Iranian gas. This is not something that I look into it very closely, but you're the expert on it.
Yeah, and I think Jean-Philippe, so it's Javad Kapoor, if I'm pronouncing correctly, making a comment that anyway, Iran is dealing with its own imbalance. I
Yeah.
agree. And political tensions with Israel and US. Yes, exactly what I've mentioned. So we will be really lucky if we avoid massive military conflict in the next year, if in this year in the region. And anyway, I suspect that Iran, for the time being, is no go for the European decision makers. Yeah. So in this situation of limited options for natural gas, what do you think about these strategic partnerships for the critical minerals? Does it look better?
It's a very interesting dynamics there. So all of these things feed into one another, right? Because we've got multiple irons in the fire, at least from a Europe's energy strategy point of view. And as I alluded to in an earlier part of the conversation, Europe's green and digital future relies on materials that it does not produce. And when you think about that, when you put that in context, while we have, they have set the ambitious target to change this, extracting more at home, processing more within Europe, ensuring that no single supplier dominates our market, all of this is great. But the reality is that these goals, while they're necessary, they're incredibly difficult to achieve at some levels because the investment is not there. The timelines are really tight. And as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, the world is shifting faster than our policies can adapt. And we've seen that in the last 2 months. The world is shifting faster than it's such a crowded news cycle that I find it really hard to wrap my head around a lot of things that are going around. So if we are really to be serious about securing Europe's future, we need to look beyond the European borders, really. And that means more new partnerships, new supplying routes, new ways of thinking about resource security. And for me, that is the most important part of it is how can we think new ways about our resource security? That's the most important piece that will answer a lot of the other questions there. So that means, to a great extent, deepening some of these partnerships that we have in Africa, in Latin America, as well as closer to home in regions and the resources that we need in the Eurasian region, for example, in Central Asia, as an example. But resource diplomacy is more than what is in the ground. I think it's more about access, investment, and long-term stability. And I emphasis on the word investment, because that is really the linchpin of a lot of things that we're talking about today. So the two regions stand out particularly strategic, but perhaps slightly underutilized players, Ukraine and Central Asia. I'm sure people, a few weeks ago, there was in the news cycle about uh, Ukraine and its resource availability. I think uh, it's a very interesting idea. Ukraine's role in Europe's security and particularly resource security is both critical as well as complicated. Um, when you look at the country, it has immense wealth, and they have 22 out of the 34 critical raw materials that Europe has identified, if I'm not mistaken. But as we all know, that the war has severely disrupted its ability to extract, process, or export them. So, and all the traditional Black Sea shipping routes are no longer viable. So, it's really forcing Ukraine to rely on slower, more expensive rail transport. Infrastructure has been damaged, as we all know. And attracting foreign investment in the middle of a war is never going to be easy. There was a very, I encourage the audience today to read this very interesting report that I read from CSIS on Ukraine. I thought that was a very sharp succinct summary of what's going on at the back of the news that was coming out of America. But despite all of these challenges, Ukraine does seem to be pushing forward. The government recently said that it was privatizing key mining assets. The United Mining and Chemical Company, which is one of the world's top titanium producers, and they know that securing investment is now essential for rebuilding the economy in the long run as well. And from Europe's point of view, helping Ukraine develop its mining sector beyond the resources and that focuses on economic resilience as well as post-war recovery is a great idea. The Commission, the European Commission announced at some point the comprehensive support package in February, I think February of this year. And that is to secure entire Ukraine's energy system and enable full integration into the European energy market and so on. Lots of interesting bits and pieces to that bit. There is a roadmap and a step-by-step cooperation, but as I said, nothing is easy, especially when you're in the middle of the war. So what I really want to ask you at this point, Tatiana, is perhaps it might be useful for you to share your thoughts as we've discussed before. Your views on this protracted war that we have in our neighborhood, and what is the likelihood of that? Because there is a huge potential here to be tapped into, which is mutually beneficial. And it all depends on how this is all going to end up or
Yeah.
mature, or I don't know. I don't know what there's no finality or in that statement. I find it really hard to put a finality to it, but please.
You see, it's, I mean, what is the end game? Yeah, it's the question I'm asking for the last 3 years, and frankly, I don't see the answer. There could be, as I was saying from the very beginning, there could be a ceasefire, or there could be some sort of temporary relief, but I don't see a long-term sustainable solution which will provide like a stable construction which will not fall apart with the first border tension, which are inevitable. So if you imagine all these people in Ukraine who are trying to protect their lives and their country and their neighborhood, yeah, and if you imagine the degree of hate and fear and aggression in this area, which is absolutely understandable, any ceasefire can be violated at any moment, and it is out of control of any central authorities. Just to keep in mind that there will be even within the ceasefire, there will be lots of conflicts and different tensions along any borderline that they will draw. Yeah. It means that there will be lots of pretexts for Russia to step in again. And the transformation that Russia had during the last 3 years, which made it a real militarized economy, not of the Soviet type, it still has a lot of market components, but it is much, much more militarized than it was before the war. And it is the mechanism which has to work. Yeah, it will take a couple of years to replenish the military equipment stocks. Okay, but then this machine will need some further expansion. Yeah, so being in EU, yeah, I would always feel, very cautious regarding the future Russia's plans. And though I see in the chat box, for example, Bruno Irini is proposing, okay, let's forget it. Let's just cut all the middlemen and go to trade with Russia directly. Yeah, you can. Yeah, and Russia would be absolutely happy to do so. And it will be cheaper because you will not have to pay for these intermediaries. But like with any financial portfolio, yeah, like with any risk management, you don't want to put all your savings on very risky startup which can collapse tomorrow. Yeah, you can put 5% or 10% of your money in high risk asset. Yeah, with Russia, we know for sure that it's a high risk asset. It was demonstrated already several times. And it is very clear that when for Putin or any of his successors, there is a choice, geopolitical game or contractual obligations, geopolitical dimension is much more important than any loss of reputation, economic losses, whatever. So Russia is a risky partner. I mean, being Russian, I don't feel pleasant saying this, but that's the reality, which has to be kept in mind. You can interact with a risky partner, but you need to have some insurances and you have to, develop some hedge mechanisms to offset these risks. Yeah. What are these hedge mechanisms and how these risks can be offset? That's
Yeah.
another question. But
Yeah, it is a tough trade-off. Purely in economics, yes, it makes a lot of sense. But geopolitically, it reintroduces that Russian leverage and undermines Western unity to some extent. So ultimately, we have to ask ourselves, is energy security just about price or is it about control?
there is also a very good question. I think Lawrence Jones is asking it. When comparing all these strategies, how do we humanize the long-term geopolitics? Are these conflicts inevitable, or will shifting demographics of global leadership mean we have a different world? Oh, Lawrence, I would love to see a different world. I'm pacifist. Yeah,
So
but
do I. And,
yeah,
and so do I. Yeah, absolutely.
realistically speaking, not in the next decade, at least,
I
unfortunately.
think geopolitics often feels like a game of chess played by faithless nations. Right? This is how it is: energy crisis, supply chain war, economic competition. But in reality, it's a series of human decisions shaped by leaders, by cultures, by shifting demographics of each era. And if you want to humanize the long term cliffs, we have to stop treating geopolitics like some sort of mechanical process and look at it as a generational process, or as a generational struggle or a psychological struggle, the one that where you have priorities or lived experiences or cultural memories of those in power. How will future leaders see the world? Are these conflicts inevitable? Can we outgrow them? Those are all quite difficult questions because I don't think conflict happens because nations want war. Some may. you can't you can't quite make a blank statement like that. But because the economic security and security interests make war seem rational at the time. So it's not like they want war, but those reasons drive them. Um, can a shift happen peacefully? Historically, if I look back in the history, no major power shift has happened without a fight of some sort. Um, History seemed to be repeating itself if you were to look behind. But that is a fantastic question. I would love, like you, to see a world where we start treating all of this as a mechanical process and really understand the human elements of it. Is because at the end of the day, I want to reiterate that all of these are human decisions shaped by people like us with cultures driving, cultural hegemony plays a big role there. And we also need to think about that intergenerational, every generation, every time, the new people come, they think about things differently. So maybe the generation after us can solve that problem.
Hopefully. But well, you know what I thought while you were talking, that actually this whole discussion about geopolitics and the situation where Europe finds itself right now, it's really, I mean, it's really also requiring some sort of mobilization. When I was explaining what happens within Russia, which is becoming mobilized, when I was explaining how China was dealing with its energy security concerns, it's also like EU very much import dependent, but it has always admitted it and developed strategies specifically to manage those risks. Yeah. So for Europe, it's really becoming a moment of truth. Yeah, to mobilize, to focus, to develop strategy, not just some chaotic movements here and there. And Andrew Norgate is asking like 7 years to build a new nuclear power plant, but it doesn't have to. To what degree do you think Europe energy situation would have to change in order for regulations to take a backseat to the need to keep the lights and heating on during a cold winter? Remember how fast these LNG regas terminals were built in Germany in the winter of 2022. So it's possible when needed. But what should happen in the perception of the European citizens and European decision makers in order to fasten this process?
Yeah, I think the Europe's energy crisis has already exposed this brutal trade-off between regulation and survival. And when push comes to shove, governments will always prioritize keeping the lights on over bureaucratic red tape. I want to say that, and I hope that that remains true in its whole sense. Um, the question on how bad things have to get before we ditch regulatory, oh, that's really talking about the breaking point. How much, uh, when we think about the current situation, Europe's energy security is fragile at the moment. But not yet at the crisis level, so not perhaps big enough to force radical deregulation.
So
Perhaps.
should we wait?
So history suggests that when energy scarcity reaches a certain threshold or a pain level, rules can get thrown out of the window. And you could look at it in different scenarios. It could be a mild wake up call, but not enough to change a regulation. So, energy prices spiking through winter, but government subsidies don't soften the blow. The outcome is the regulation will continue to remain slow. Nuclear bills are still going to take that amount of time. SMR is a really good game changer. Well, I'm waiting to see. The proof is in the pudding. I'm not going to say anything that is not being said already. The second scenario is really if you look at it, like a crisis winter, where regulation starts to crumble. If we had a severe winter energy shortage that is going to lead to rolling back of major blackouts in major EU cities. Yes, probably we'll see. Permitting times could be cut in half. SMR's project will be greenlit within 2 years. Europe will start building emergency build mode, so to speak. And then really the total energy collapse scenario where energy regulation is fully ignored is where when we have multi-year energy crisis, for example, where there's global fuel shortages, governments taking control over energy production, et cetera, and so on. And then the likelihood of regulation bypassed entirely. Because there's no straightforward answer, and I wanted to sort of put that into the sort of different possible scenarios, right? A scenario where it's just a gentle wake-up call, when things start to crumble and when it's completely fully disintegrated or where regulation is completely ignored. At the moment, we're not there yet. But the question again, to my mind, based on Andrew's question is, do we need to wait for a crisis for that thing to happen? And I don't know the answer to that question, honestly. I have some thoughts, but no real answer is, again, we need to pick our battles. We can't win in this current environment. We can't win everything. So things like perhaps, a pre-approved nuclear site, for example, just as a thought, or a parallel permitting and construction instead of waiting for one approval to finish before the next one starts, allow simultaneous work, for example. There's also SMR's first, gigaplants later concept, where we can do multiple things.
And
so
what do you think about deep sea mining? There is also a question for critical minerals.
Oh, okay. So
can it start anytime soon? I mean, Norway, they've allowed the first tests. Yeah, actually in the end of last year. I don't know if this test production has started already, like pilot project. So what do you think? Maybe this could be a solution for Europe. Very high tech, very advanced technologies, very deep sea waters, like really advanced technologies, not just simple stuff.
Very exciting and very interesting topic, something that I'm very keen to learn more myself as things develop. But as things stand, yes, Norway has announced plans, but it's also important Norway has announced a 1-year pause on plans to mine the area of the seabed. So it's not exactly straightforward. And the seabed we're talking about is the size of the United Kingdom and Ireland put together. That's the space that we're talking about. There are lots of work currently in progress with the demand that is projected to grow. I think the real challenge there is large-scale extraction technology, which is really critical for such an exercise, is not yet readily available. And that makes deep sea mining temporarily unlikely. As we clear these bottlenecks, it might ease soon. There's also significant environmental concerns. There are about 800 or so experts, or probably nearly 1,000 experts from this organization, the International Seabed Authority, or ISA, and they are supporting a 10-year moratorium on deep sea mining. Companies like BMW, Volvo, Renault, you've seen them recently distancing themselves from deep sea mining due to environmental concerns. They are the people with deep pockets. Talk about vertical integration there, right?
Sorry.
No, it's interesting, but I don't think the technology is there yet. We're not going to solve tomorrow's problem with deep sea mining tomorrow.
And
probably
with controlled fusion, there is also a question about fusion. Not for the next 5-7 years. We need to look at some more conventional technologies for the nearest future.
Something that excites me, something that will shape in the future. It has a huge potential. It's a new frontier for critical mineral extraction. I recently attended a very interesting lecture on space mining. So that
Oh,
was, yes, absolutely. And that's a very interesting topic to explore as well. But I think we need to focus on the terrestrial part first right now before we go deep sea and into the
Otto
space.
Mars, yeah.
Yeah, but yes, again, bottom line is great potential. It's a new frontier. It's a great opportunity. We don't have the technology to do those large scale issues yet, and there is a 10-year moratorium right now on that. Even Norway has put a 1-year pause on it.
Yeah. So look, unfortunately, we are already at the end of our time frame. Actually, we've even
Wow.
exceeded it slightly. I didn't see how the time was flying. And I really enjoyed this conversation. Once again, I felt that this energy trilemma where we are trying, I mean, policymakers, not us advisors, but policymakers are trying to optimize affordability, energy security, and environmental acceptability of the fuel mix. It's really a moving target where you always try to find some balance, but basically you have to accept that you are always failing to find a perfect balance. You have to sacrifice something in order to get better performance in the other dimension. We at New Energy Advancement Hub have even developed an online game on energy trilemma, and I
Yeah.
will ask my colleagues actually to put the link to this game. It's absolutely free, so you can entertain yourself. You can start with a rich country for which it's quite easy to go through the game. But if you go to the next step, if you are a petrostate or if you are developing agrarian economy, then you will find that balancing these three dimensions is becoming really, really very difficult. But if we are like summarizing the whole discussion that we had today regarding Europe specifically, yeah,
Mm.
in this quite difficult situation, which is not a complete disaster when people are freezing in their houses. Yeah, it's not that urgent. So at a first glance, it's still okay. If you go deeper in the details, you see that there are challenges basically on each and every component of the European energy supplies, at least energy imports, whether it is traditional fossil fuels or new critical materials or technologies. So, how do you think, what are the most important two or three components on which Europe should focus right now? Like the first steps, which are the must.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And we need to stop spreading, ourselves thin and double down on three things. And these three things actually will determine the future of power. One is energy independence, because if there's no energy, there's no industry. Um, Lots of exciting work being done by our friends in the industry, both from a political point of view as well as within companies. We need to pick this battle. That's the battle, one battle we need to pick for sure, because without cheap, stable, when I say cheap, let's say affordable, stable energy, Europe becomes a high tech museum. We don't want to be the high tech museum. We want to be at the front and center of it. The second part is we've got to have control over our critical technologies, because innovation without production is absolutely useless. We invented the chip, but we barely make them. Just as an example, we know US and China are subsidizing semiconductor dominance. Europe is leading in AI regulation, but falling behind on in building that AI capability, because all of that AI infrastructure is in the US hands right now. China owns battery, solar, and EV supply chain, and Europe is paying premium prices for the technology that it helped develop. So we've got to pick that battle as well, because technology sovereignty equals economic and military sovereignty. And the third bit is have that geopolitical leverage, because right now Europe is everyone's ATM machine. Without the geopolitical power, Europe becomes a rule taker, not a rule maker. So we need to stop wasting too much energy on. I am a fan of regulation to some extent, but I think over regulating its own industries to a point where innovation dies is not helpful. We also need to stop trying to be a moral referee. And before coming to this call, one of the things I challenge myself is to have that courage to challenge my own implicit biases. And one of the things that we have to say out openly with no shame is we cannot be try and be the moral referee where we are still doing business with many states, authoritarian or so, and relying on wishful thinking, because instead of creating a real industrial strategy, we're just doing a lot of wishful thinking. So Europe needs to pick these three battles for sure, because if it doesn't, US and China will pick them for Europe. And as I mentioned before, we can't be fighting everywhere, all the battles, can't have too many irons in the fire. Nothing goes to plan, but really think about this strategically. And I highly recommend the game on the energy trilemma game, because when you move one thing, the other thing completely skews up, and people can see how difficult this conversation is. But I also am deeply aware that things don't happen overnight. But the fact that we have the courage to have this conversation and talk about things, and expect or move this in the right path to success is a great starting point. We shouldn't be shy of um, challenging our own biases and assumptions when it comes to these markets, and this is something that I try every day. The other really important bit is when you're talking about the energy trilemma game is one thing that everyone is really trying to wrap their head around, like myself and you, and we're all, this news cycle is so crowded, and it's very important to understand the news versus noise. What should we think about? What should we not think about? And Europe should take that itself as a sort of primary foundational example. Say, okay, a lot of noise coming out. What is material impact? Forget the things that we can't make any difference to. It will remain as such. Where are the meaningful interactions that we can have? Can we move this A, B, and C tree, and then let's run with it? This is like a corporate strategy, right? So we can't just focus on tactics and be reactionary. We need to learn to respond and be a bit more proactive as well, and set our own path and future, because this is a great crisis, fantastic opportunities as much as the challenges are. We just need to figure out how do we align this.
Excellent. Fantastic. I love it. And to finish on the inspirational note, as you said, guys, let's not waste a good crisis. So, yeah, thank you so much for being with us. I think it was a really very good conversation. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so
And
much. Yeah,
goodbye
thank
to
you very
all
much,
our
Tatiana.
participants. Thank you. Goodbye.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tatiana, and to the NEAH team and to everyone for tuning in. I hope this has been useful, and please feel free to reach out. We would love to have a chat with a more bigger chat. We need to create a round table, is what I think.
We will. Why not? Let's start preparation. Sounds like a
Perfect.
plan.
Wonderful. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. Oh, I can disconnect. Okay.